The Honourable Member for Winnipeg South Centre.
Well, thanks very much, Madam Speaker. It's always a pleasure to rise in the House on behalf of those I represent in Winnipeg South Centre. The budget is one of the most important documents that are tabled in this chamber every year. It's something that sets forward the priorities for the government and a vision for the country moving forward. And I also have tremendous amount of respect for the process that ensues after a budget is tabled. And that is that we get to engage in dialogue here with our colleagues who are themselves representing tens of thousands of people in the communities that they come from. And I appreciate the opportunity to engage in that dialogue with them here today. Comme toujours, Madame la Présidente, je vais essayer le mieux.
As always, Madam Speaker, I will try my best to practice my French. I think that my Bloc colleagues will probably ask me a question, so I will do my best during debate to speak in French a bit, and I will of course answer their questions in French.
Speaker, during what was my not-so-recent by-election in June, or increasingly not-so-recent by-election of June of this past year, I talked to constituents who conveyed a number of priorities to me. And of course, the priorities of voters are as varied as the voters themselves. However, there were a number of issues that emerged frequently as what I would call the top priorities on the minds of those in Winnipeg South Centre. And they were focused primarily, Madam Speaker, on the environment, on mental health and addiction and healthcare broadly speaking, on reconciliation, and on affordability, with a particular focus on housing. So it's with respect to these priorities, Madam Speaker, that I rise today and focus the contents of my speech in regards to this budget. The environment. There is no doubt, Madam Speaker, that we are at a crisis level, both here in the country and globally. Smoke fills the air that we breathe during the summertime, preventing kids from going to camp or the elderly from going outside. There are droughts, which in the fragile soil of a place like Manitoba, where I come from in the prairie, it crumbles, leading to devastating consequences on the foundations of homes, which lead to significant costs and irritants on the part of constituents. There are dangerous heat waves, Madam Speaker, that make life dangerous for vulnerable citizens, most particularly the elderly in my riding. And there are, of course, increased costs that come along with climate change. I've had the pleasure of serving on both the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food, as well as the Standing Committee on Indigenous Northern Affairs since joining colleagues here in Parliament, and have noted how often concerns around climate change and the environment are raised in the context of our discussions at those committees. The Canadian Climate Institute, Madam Speaker, which is a nationally respected organization of scientists and policy experts in the country, have recently published a report which has spoken to us about the state of affairs vis-a-vis climate change and climate policies in Canada. It's important to note that policies are working, Madam Speaker. Without a combination of the environmental policies that we have in place right now, put forward by our government, emissions would be 40% higher than they are today. By 2030, if the policies combined that we have implemented thus far remain in place, we will see a reduction in emissions that equal the combination of both the province of Ontario and Quebec together, Madam Speaker. We are continuing to protect the environment, and we're doing it in meaningful ways, but I want to take the opportunity to talk about how we are protecting the environment specifically in my home province of Manitoba. Madam Speaker, we have made historic investments in Lake Winnipeg, a place that is not only of significant importance personally to many of those I represent, but as one of the world's largest freshwater lakes, it plays a critical role in the preservation of our environment. The same can be true of Lake of the Woods, which is just over the Manitoba border into Ontario, where my honourable colleague from Kenora represents, and in fact, as I've stated in this House before, serves as my member of Parliament when we're out there. And we have been investing intentionally in the preservation and the sustainability of that valuable piece of water as well, Madam Speaker. The Seal River watershed is one of the world's largest remaining intact watersheds, and it is something that, working alongside First Nations communities in Manitoba and the provincial government in Manitoba, we have invested in order to ensure its protection moving forward. And important to note, Madam Speaker, and this is thanks in large part to the work of my colleague, the honourable member from Winnipeg South, is that there is a new national water agency that will be headquartered in the heart of the prairies in Winnipeg. And this is going to play a critical role in how we sustain and preserve our environment for generations to come. Canada must do its part, Madam Speaker, not only on moral grounds, but from an economic perspective. In terms of our relationship with trading partners, if we do not have aggressive policies in place domestically that effectively counter the impacts and the disastrous consequences of climate change, Madam Speaker, we will be left out of future trade deals with our partners, and worse, we will be taxed on our imports. It is critical that we maintain direction like the one that we have established. I want to shift now, Madam Speaker, to talk for a few moments about mental health and addiction. And this is an issue that's deeply personal to me for a number of reasons. One is that I have several very close family members who for years have struggled with addiction issues and mental health issues. I cannot count how many times I've received a knock on the door from a police officer, had to drive a family member to the emergency room, gone to visit family members in a psych ward, or engaged in very difficult tensions that emerge in families when we try to figure out the best ways in which we can support those we love who are dealing with mental health and addictions crises. In addition to that, Madam Speaker, my mother is one of the leading addictions doctors and specialists in the province of Manitoba. It's something that gives me tremendous pride, and it is through much of her work that I am not only inspired to help, but through which I derive much of my information and understanding of the issues. So I want to talk very briefly, Madam Speaker, about the ways in which this budget addresses some of the mental health and addictions crises that we're facing in the country. Recently, the Minister of Mental Health and Addiction visited my hometown of Winnipeg with me, and we visited the only mobile overdose prevention site between Thunder Bay and, I believe, Saskatoon. And it's called Sunshine House. And Sunshine House is a remarkable place. In a recent report, which was done through an independent audit, there were 26,154 visits in 1 year, last year, to Sunshine House, which fortunately resulted in no deaths and only 20 overdoses. Suicide prevention is a critical component of the government's policy, and the introduction of the Suicide Prevention Crisis Hotline is very, very important for the future of our country. Briefly, as I know my time is running short, Madam Speaker, the Canadian Centre for Child Protection, which is located in my riding of Winnipeg South Centre, is doing amazing work not only in the country but around the world to protect children, specifically from online harms. And we have provided funding that will allow them to continue to do this important work. And I was very pleased to see, Madam Speaker, particularly as a former teacher and principal, that there was $500 million invested in a youth mental health fund. I wanted to elaborate a little bit in regards to reconciliation, which was the final piece. And I won't have time to expand, although if one of my colleagues is gracious enough to ask me a question in regards to that, I'd be happy to take some time to respond. But I want to note that so much of the legacy of residential schools is still with us. I saw it every single day when I worked with young Indigenous kids and their families. And I'm so pleased to see that there's $96 million in our budget that's going to go to helping support survivors, as the trauma, the intergenerational trauma, is still very much applicable when we talk about the challenges that we face. So with that, Madam Speaker, I am pleased to have had the opportunity to rise today on behalf of those I represent, and I'm happy to take questions now from my colleagues. Thank you.